In the quiet moments before dawn, a brutal act shatters the fragile illusion one man has spent years constructing. This isn't a story about jealousy, rage, or passion, the kind of motives that often dominate headlines and capture public attention. Instead, it's a story about something far colder, far more calculated: the desperate preservation of an image. For this man, the murder was never about protecting a secret relationship. It was about protecting the persona he had carefully forged, a persona built on fear, intimidation, and an unyielding need to appear dangerous. From the outside, the narrative seems straightforward. A self-styled gangster, desperate to hide who he truly loved, commits a crime to keep that truth buried. The motive feels obvious: fear of exposure, the humiliation of being seen for who he really was, the vulnerability of revealing a hidden identity. But this story is not what it appears to be. The surface-level explanation is just a mask, a distraction from the chilling reality underneath. What he feared wasn't the truth of his heart. It was the unraveling of the image he had spent a lifetime constructing. This man thrived on perception. His power wasn't rooted in genuine strength, but in the fear he inspired in others. He lived by the reputation he cultivated, a reputation steeped in menace and control. To survive socially, to command respect and obedience, he had to look dangerous. The illusion was everything. Without it, he was nothing. His life was a performance, a constant act of intimidation designed to keep others at bay and maintain a fragile grip on power. The murder was his final, desperate attempt to keep that act intact. As you listen to the story, you might be tempted to settle on the easy explanation. But beware, the commonly accepted motive is incomplete. There are layers beneath the surface, darker and more unsettling than anyone imagined. The crime wasn't about hiding a relationship or suppressing love. It was about preserving a lie so complete that its destruction would mean losing everything, not just respect but identity itself. By the end of the story, you'll understand that what he tried to hide wasn't just who he loved. It was who he truly was, and who he was pretending not to be. This is a tale not of passion, but of survival through deception, where the stakes were life and death, and the truth was the most dangerous secret of all. Stay with us, because the truth will change everything you thought you knew. What does it mean to protect an image? To guard a reputation so fiercely that the truth becomes a threat, not a liberation. The man at the center of this story was not merely concealing a forbidden love. He was hiding the core of his identity, the part of himself he feared would unravel everything he had built. In that silent, trembling space where fear and self-preservation meet, the question lingers: are people more terrified of exposing who they really are than of the consequences that truth might bring? As you consider this, imagine the delicate balance between the self we present to the world and the self we keep locked away. How much of our energy and intention goes into maintaining this facade? And when the line between image and reality blurs, what becomes of the person we thought we knew? This case unsettles because it forces us to confront that shadowy space within ourselves, the part where fear of exposure can drive actions more desperate than any crime. Reflect on the weight of reputation, not merely as a social currency, but as a shield against vulnerability. When reputation is threatened, what lengths will someone go to in order to protect it? And what does that say about the truths they bury beneath layers of deception? These are not just abstract questions. They are the very threads weaving through the story we're unraveling. You're invited to hold these thoughts close as we move forward. Consider your own perspective. Is preserving an image more frightening than revealing the truth? Does the fear of exposure create a prison more confining than any external threat? Share your reflections below, not to solve the mystery, but to explore the human complexity at its heart. The real motive remains hidden, waiting to surface, challenging everything you believe about identity, fear, and the secrets we keep. He was never truly a crime boss. He was a man who had mastered the art of performance, a role he played with meticulous care. His power was a fragile construct built on perception rather than reality, a castle of cards held together by fear and uncertainty. Unlike the genuine crime lords who wielded influence through networks of loyalty and tangible control, he relied on shadows and whispers, on the idea that he was someone to be feared. His authority existed only as long as others believed in it, and that belief was a delicate illusion he maintained with calculated gestures and carefully orchestrated displays. Image was everything to him, the foundation of his entire existence. He understood that, in the world of shadow crimes, appearances could be as potent as actual power. The way he dressed, the places he frequented, the company he kept, all were carefully curated to reinforce his fabricated image. Every intimidating glare, every casual mention of violence, was a performance designed to keep others at bay. His reputation was a currency far more valuable than any weapon or muscle he could command because it shaped how he was perceived. Without a solid reputation, he was nothing but a man in a suit, vulnerable and exposed. Intimidation replaced genuine authority in his dealings. Where real crime bosses commanded respect through a network of alliances, favors, and fear rooted in past actions, he substituted with bravado and threats that barely concealed his insecurity. His voice, low and measured, carried the weight of menace only because people expected it to. He never had to follow through on many of his threats. The mere suggestion of violence was enough to keep his rivals at a distance. This reliance on fear as a tool was both his strength and his weakness, effective so long as no one called his bluff. His reputation was his primary defense mechanism, a shield constructed out of stories and rumors that grew with each retelling. In the dimly lit backrooms and smoky bars where deals were whispered, his name was spoken with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Those closest to him could see the hesitation behind his confident facade, the moments when his eyes flickered with doubt. The danger he projected was a fragile veneer. Without it, he was vulnerable, exposed as a man grasping for control he did not truly possess. His identity was inseparable from this carefully maintained image. To lose the perception of danger was to lose everything. He lived in constant tension, aware that exposure would unravel the mask he wore so well. Every interaction was a delicate balance, a performance where the stakes were his survival. This dependency created a prison more confining than any physical cell, a world where truth was a threat and illusion the only means of protection. He was not a king of crime but an actor trapped in a role that defined his very existence. A man whose power was a shadow, a performance, and nothing more. The hidden lover was a quiet contradiction, a presence that existed only in the margins of his carefully constructed life. She was someone who understood the perilous tightrope he walked daily, the fragile web of deception that kept him afloat. Their connection was forged in whispers, stolen moments, and glances that vanished before anyone else could notice. Yet, what made their relationship so fragile wasn't just the danger of discovery but the stark imbalance between them. He had everything to lose: his reputation, his carefully curated identity, even his safety. The smallest misstep could unravel years of painstaking effort, exposing not only his secrets but also the vulnerabilities he had worked so hard to hide. In contrast, she trusted him, trusted the silence that cloaked their connection, and accepted the shadows as the only space where their bond could live. For her, discretion was an act of faith, a conscious surrender to the necessity of secrecy. But for him, secrecy was not a shield. It was a leash, a form of control that kept the relationship confined and carefully managed. He dictated when and where they could meet, how they communicated, and what could be shared. This was not protection born out of love but control born out of fear. The secrecy was a cage, one that he held the key to but refused to open. She was a secret he could show no one, a truth he could never fully embrace without risking everything. He needed her close yet distant, present yet invisible, an impossible balance that only deepened the tension between them. Their relationship was a fragile dance, choreographed by his fears and her willingness to comply. The dynamic was uneven, the scales tipped heavily against her autonomy. She lived in the margins, her presence a carefully guarded secret that existed more as an extension of his needs than as a mutual partnership. This imbalance was never spoken aloud, but it hung between them like an unbreakable silence. The paradox of their bond was that it thrived precisely because it was forbidden. Yet, that very prohibition made it a source of pain as much as pleasure. Every moment spent together was shadowed by the knowledge that it could be their last, every smile tinged with the risk of exposure. The hidden lover was a symbol of what he desired but could never openly claim, a reminder of the life he sacrificed to maintain the fragile illusion of control. Now, I want to ask you, do you think people are more afraid of losing their reputation than losing the relationships that truly matter? It's a question that cuts to the heart of what keeps so many bonds hidden in the dark, tangled in fear and silence. Leave your thoughts below. I'm curious to hear what you believe. Back in their world of shadows, the hidden lover remained a constant reminder of the cost of living behind a mask. She was a secret whispered in the night, a presence that could never be seen but was felt deeply, a connection defined less by freedom and more by the chains of secrecy. And in that silence, he held the power, yet it was a power that imprisoned them both. The man lived in a world where perception was everything. His entire existence hinged on a carefully crafted persona, a fortress of myths, half-truths, and silent agreements that kept him above reproach and beyond reach. In the labyrinth of social hierarchies and whispered alliances, exposure was not just a threat. It was the unraveling of the very fabric that held him together. To be unmasked would be to strip away the armor that made him relevant, feared, and, most importantly, untouchable. Behind the public face lay a fragile core, a psychological landscape fraught with anxiety and relentless vigilance. Every gesture, every word, had been honed to maintain the illusion of control. The man's power radiated not merely from what he did but from what others believed he was capable of. This belief was a currency far more valuable than money or influence. It was the invisible thread connecting him to a world that thrived on reputation. Without it, he would become just another shadow, easily forgotten or worse, exposed to scorn. The fear of exposure went far beyond the embarrassment that most might associate with scandal or failure. It was an existential terror, a dread that the hidden cracks in his carefully constructed image would be laid bare for all to see. Such exposure would not only humiliate him publicly but would fundamentally destroy the persona that justified his place in the social order. Once the facade crumbled, the consequences would ripple outward, dismantling alliances and inviting attacks from enemies who had long waited for such a weakness. The man knew that to lose face was to lose everything, the respect, the loyalty, and the silence that protected him from legal repercussions and personal vendettas alike. In this environment, humiliation was a weapon far deadlier than any courtroom verdict. The legal consequences, while serious, were almost secondary to the devastation wrought by social annihilation. The man's world was governed by unspoken rules where shame was a form of capital, and once spent, it could never be regained. The social death that followed exposure meant isolation, vulnerability, and the erasure of power. It was a sentence worse than any prison, because it stripped away the very identity that had allowed him to navigate the perilous shadows with impunity. Moreover, the psychological weight of this fear permeated every aspect of his life. Paranoia became a constant companion, shadowing his decisions and interactions. Trust was a scarce resource, doled out sparingly because each misstep could lead to catastrophe. The man was acutely aware that the tiniest slip, an overheard conversation, a misplaced document, or a single betrayal, could ignite a chain reaction that would expose not only his secrets but the intricate web of complicity that sustained him. In this sense, exposure was not simply the threat of revelation but the collapse of an entire ecosystem built on silence and fear. It was a final, irreversible act that would dismantle the delicate balance between power and vulnerability, leaving the man stripped bare and defenseless. The very persona that had kept him relevant, feared, and untouchable would dissolve into nothingness, replaced by the harsh light of truth and the cold judgment of those who once bowed before him. Ultimately, the man's dread of exposure was not rooted in the tangible penalties of law but in the intangible but far more potent consequences of social ruin. It was a fear that transcended reason, driving him to desperate measures to protect the illusion at all costs. In the shadows where he thrived, exposure meant the end, not just of a reputation but of the fragile identity that had sustained him through countless battles fought in silence and secrecy. The weight pressing down on him was no longer a subtle strain but a relentless force, tightening with every breath he took. His mind, once sharp and calculating, now frayed at the edges, unraveling into frantic thoughts that spiraled uncontrollably. The illusion he had so meticulously woven was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand, and with each passing moment, the distance between his carefully crafted facade and the brutal truth grew narrower. The pressure wasn't just external. It gnawed from within, a ceaseless whisper turning into a deafening roar that drowned reason and rationality. Paranoia crept into every corner of his existence, transforming familiar faces into potential threats, every shadow a lurking menace. His senses heightened, yet distorted, filtering reality through a lens warped by fear. The world around him morphed into a maze of suspicion, where allies could be enemies and silence could betray him. He no longer trusted the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, convinced it echoed the steps of pursuers closing in. This paranoia was not born from concrete evidence but from the intangible terror that his deception was unraveling. And with it, everything he had fought to preserve was doomed to collapse. His hands trembled as he attempted to piece together fragmented thoughts, each decision a frantic grasp at control slipping further away. The calm deliberation that might have once guided him was replaced by impulsive reactions, moves made not with clarity, but desperation. Every choice was a gamble against time, a frantic bid to stave off the inevitable exposure. The illusion wasn't just a veneer, it was the very foundation of his existence, and the fear of its destruction obliterated any semblance of measured judgment. He knew that hesitation could cost him everything, yet action felt like stepping deeper into a trap. The loss of control was absolute. Moments blurred into one another. The boundary between past mistakes and looming consequences dissolved in a haze of panic. His thoughts fractured, jumping from one worst-case scenario to the next, each more catastrophic than the last. There was no room for calm reasoning, no space for hesitation, only the urgent need to act before the fragile balance shattered completely. This was not a calculated crime. It was a primal response, a defense mechanism triggered by the overwhelming dread that the illusion, his sanctuary, was slipping away. In this frenzied state, the man's actions became erratic, unpredictable. The careful plans he once clung to disintegrated under the weight of his mounting terror. Every move was reactive, born from a mind gripped by panic rather than strategy. The crime itself was less a choice than an inevitability, a desperate bid to silence the encroaching chaos that threatened to expose his darkest truths. He was no longer the architect of his fate, but a prisoner to fear, driven not by reason but by the unrelenting need to protect the fragile identity that had sustained him in the shadows for so long. The decision was not sudden. It was the culmination of a mounting pressure that had twisted his thoughts into a narrow tunnel, where only one escape seemed viable. To him, eliminating the source of his anxiety was the ultimate form of damage control, a final measure designed to sever the threat at its root. He convinced himself that by removing this one individual, the fragile balance he so desperately clung to would be restored, and the creeping chaos that threatened his existence would dissipate. The act was coldly pragmatic in his mind, not born of passion or rage, but of a calculated resolve to end the risk permanently. He viewed the person as a problem, an obstacle that, if left alive, would continue to unravel everything he had built in the shadows. The thought process was chilling in its simplicity. If the threat was gone, so too would be the danger. Yet, this mindset revealed a profound misunderstanding of the nature of the forces at play. He failed to grasp that the threat was not confined to a single figure but was woven into a broader fabric of suspicion, circumstance, and consequence. By focusing solely on the individual, he ignored the ripple effects that his actions would unleash. In his isolated world, where paranoia had become a constant companion, the murder was framed as an act of necessity, an unavoidable step to secure his survival. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Every hesitation, he believed, would only invite exposure. The act was methodical, stripped of theatrics or excess, executed with the precision of someone who viewed it as a business transaction rather than a moral transgression. His detachment was a shield, a way to distance himself from the irreversible reality he was creating. What he failed to foresee was how the removal would not erase the threat but rather amplify it. The absence of the individual did not silence the questions or quell the suspicions. It only shifted the focus. The shadows that had once been peripheral now loomed larger, their outlines sharper and more menacing. The problem was no longer a single person but the entire network of secrets and lies that his desperate act had failed to address. His attempt at damage control had, paradoxically, ignited a new cascade of risks, exposing vulnerabilities he had not anticipated. Throughout it all, he remained convinced that the murder was a solution, a definitive end to the peril that haunted him. This conviction was both his strength and his undoing, blinding him to the complexity of the situation and the resilience of the forces arrayed against him. In his mind, the danger was a tangible enemy that could be fought and defeated with decisive action. In reality, it was a diffuse, persistent presence that could not be eliminated by removing a single piece from the puzzle. The murder, then, was not simply a crime but a misguided attempt to regain control, a desperate gamble to rewrite the rules of a game he no longer understood. It was a stark reminder of how fear can distort judgment, how the allure of a simple solution can mask the intricate and enduring nature of the threats we face. In trying to silence one voice, he awakened many others, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, vulnerability, and the shadows that bind them together. He understood from the start that the story he needed the world to accept couldn't be one of weakness or confusion. It had to be a narrative that fit neatly into the image people already held of him. A hardened figure, unyielding and in control, the quintessential gangster who thrived in the chaos he cultivated. When the dust settled and the whispers began to spread, he stepped forward with a carefully crafted explanation that played to the expectations of those who had long watched from the sidelines, waiting for confirmation of their darkest suspicions. His account was straightforward, almost predictably brutal. He claimed that the events unfolding were the result of a calculated strike by rival factions, a power play designed to weaken his grip and expose vulnerabilities. He portrayed himself as a man forced into a corner, responding with the ruthless efficiency and cold pragmatism that anyone familiar with his reputation would expect. In this version, there was no room for doubt or sympathy, only the clear, hard lines of a man who accepted the risks of his world and met them head-on. What made this explanation so effective was how seamlessly it aligned with the public's perception. Years of whispered rumors, news reports filled with half-truths, and the sensationalized accounts of his exploits had built an image of him as a figure who thrived on intimidation and control, someone who would stop at nothing to defend his empire. The story he presented reinforced those notions, offering a familiar script that required neither empathy nor deeper scrutiny. It confirmed what many already believed, that he was a force to be reckoned with, a man who wielded power with a steady, unrelenting hand. This narrative also served to obscure the more complex reality beneath the surface, where fear and uncertainty had taken root. By framing the situation as a clear-cut battle between rival gangs, he shifted attention away from the cracks that were beginning to show within his own organization. It was a strategic move, designed not only to maintain his image but to buy time, to regroup and adapt while the world watched, anticipating the violent aftermath he promised. Moreover, his explanation tapped into the collective fascination with the gangster archetype, a figure both feared and admired for their audacity and resilience. The simplicity of the story made it compelling and easy to disseminate, ensuring that it would gain traction in the media and public discourse alike. It played into the mythos of the underworld, where survival depended on strength and cunning, and where loyalty was as fragile as the alliances it forged. Yet beneath the surface, this narrative was a carefully constructed facade. While it projected confidence and control, it masked an underlying vulnerability, a recognition that the rules of the game were shifting, and that the shadows he once commanded were growing darker and more unpredictable. By embracing the gangster image so fully, he was both reinforcing his dominance and preparing to confront the new realities that threatened to upend everything he had built. In the end, the story he told was not just about shaping public perception. It was about reclaiming a sense of agency in a world where power was no longer absolute. It was a declaration that, despite the chaos and the fractures, he remained a central figure in the ongoing struggle. A man who understood that in the shadows, control was both a weapon and a fragile illusion. Investigators found themselves grappling not just with the facts of the case, but with the eerie stillness that clung to every detail. As they sifted through statements, timelines, and physical evidence, A peculiar emotional void became impossible to ignore. It was as though the usual human reactions, the shock, the anger, the confusion, had been meticulously drained from the scene. This absence unsettled those tasked with unraveling the mystery far more than any glaring inconsistency or technical oversight might have. The calm was unnatural, almost surgical. Witnesses spoke in measured tones, their voices devoid of tremors or hesitation. Even the closest acquaintances of the key figures involved exhibited a detachment so profound it bordered on indifference. This was not numbness born of trauma or disbelief. It was a deliberate withholding, a collective silence that seemed to signify more than simple reticence. Investigators sensed that beneath the surface, a complex web of intentions and fears was constraining what could be said, or what was safe to reveal. Nothing about the unfolding investigation suggested incompetence. On the contrary, the procedural rigor was impeccable, the forensic work thorough, and the interviews precise. Every lead was pursued with professional diligence, every hypothesis tested against the evidence. Yet, despite this methodical approach, the motive behind the actions remained stubbornly incomplete. The pieces fit together, but the picture they formed was strangely hollow, lacking the emotional weight or personal rationale that usually accompanies such events. This gap created a persistent, gnawing discomfort among those involved. It was as if the silence itself was a message, a boundary drawn in invisible ink that only the most perceptive could sense. Investigators found themselves questioning not just what was left unsaid, but why it was left unsaid. The absence of motive became a clue in itself, hinting at forces at play beyond straightforward explanation, forces that demanded discretion or perhaps submission. Observers outside the immediate circle echoed this unease. Analysts and commentators noted the absence of typical human elements, grief, rage, remorse, that would ordinarily animate both the narrative and public reaction. Instead, there was a calculated restraint, a shared understanding among those connected to the case that some truths were better buried. This collective silence functioned as a barrier, shielding certain realities from scrutiny and maintaining a fragile equilibrium between exposure and concealment. For the investigators, this meant navigating a terrain where the usual tools of inquiry, interviews, evidence gathering, psychological profiling were insufficient. They had to read between the lines, interpret silences as deliberately crafted signals rather than mere gaps. This required a heightened awareness, an ability to discern the subtle dynamics of power and fear that dictated what could surface and what had to remain submerged. In this context, the story that was being pieced together was less about uncovering a straightforward crime and more about understanding a carefully maintained facade. The silence was both a symptom and a strategy, a way to control the narrative by controlling what was left unspoken. It revealed a dimension of the case that transcended individual actions, pointing instead to a collective pact of omission, a pact that complicated not only the investigation but the very nature of truth itself. Ultimately, the investigators realized that their discomfort stemmed from confronting an emptiness that was anything but accidental. The silence was deliberate, crafted to obscure, to protect, and to manipulate. It was a reminder that in the shadows where power and influence intertwine, the most dangerous secrets are often those that are never voiced, existing instead in the charged stillness between words. What the murder truly unraveled was not a secret of forbidden love or hidden desire, but the fragile architecture of a man's entire existence. A fortress built not on truth, but on fear and control. The crime did not stem from the attempt to erase a relationship. It was an act driven by the desperate need to maintain a facade, a meticulously constructed identity that allowed him to wield power without question. The victim's death shattered that illusion, exposing the hollowness beneath the surface. The man at the center of this deception had lived his life cloaked in dominance, presenting himself as untouchable, an authority figure whose every move was calculated to command obedience and respect. His reputation was a carefully maintained performance, a mask that concealed insecurity and the terror of vulnerability. The relationship he sought to hide was not the motive for murder. It was merely a symptom, a trigger that threatened to unravel the carefully spun web of lies that sustained him. Investigators began to see beyond the simplistic narrative of secrecy and shame. The silence surrounding the crime was a deliberate act of manipulation, a strategy to divert attention from the true source of danger, the lie itself. The victim's presence was a threat not because of who they were to each other, but because their connection represented a crack in the unyielding armor the man had forged. It meant that beneath the surface of his dominance lay something fragile and human, something he had spent a lifetime suppressing. This revelation reframed the entire investigation. The crime scene, once viewed as a battleground of passion or fear tied to sexuality, instead became a theater where the battle for control played out. Every detail, the absence of witnesses, the careful concealment, even the calculated nature of the violence, pointed to a man trying to erase not just a person, but the truth that person embodied. The murder was an attempt to silence the cracks in his identity before they could widen into an irrevocable collapse. As the layers peeled away, it became clear that the victim was not simply collateral damage, but an unwilling mirror reflecting the man's deepest insecurities. The relationship they shared, far from being the secret at stake, was instead a testament to the complex, conflicting humanity the man refused to acknowledge. It was this uncomfortable truth, the presence of vulnerability beneath the facade of power, that he fought to obliterate. His crime was an act of self-preservation, a violent grasp at maintaining a narrative that granted him authority in a world where he felt powerless. The investigation uncovered how this relentless pursuit of dominance had corrupted not only the man but the environment around him. Allies became enablers, silence became complicity, and truth became a threat to be extinguished. The murder was thus not simply a personal tragedy, but a symptom of a broader system, one where fear and control dictated actions more than honesty and justice ever could. In the end, the secret was never about sexuality. It was about the lengths to which someone will go to protect a lie that shields their deepest fears. The victim's death exposed a truth far more unsettling: that the greatest crimes are those committed to uphold illusions of power, and that in the shadows of such crimes, the real story is the destruction of authenticity itself. What's remarkable about this case is that the physical evidence, no matter how compelling, never truly shattered the lie. The forensic facts, the witness statements, even the digital footprints all painted a picture that could have unraveled the entire facade. Yet, it was not these tangible clues that ultimately dismantled the deception. Instead, it was the psychological unraveling. The weight of living a fabricated identity, the strain of maintaining illusions in the face of mounting pressure, and the silent terror of being exposed. The lie survived the crime itself, not because it was airtight, but because it was sustained by fear and denial. The victim's death wasn't just an attempt to conceal a secret. It was a desperate bid to delay the inevitable collapse of a carefully constructed world. Some crimes are not committed to hide the truth, but to postpone its revelation, buying time for the illusion to hold, for reputation to outlast honesty. The real violence here was psychological, a slow erosion of authenticity that leaves everyone trapped in a labyrinth of silence. The truth didn't die with the victim. It waited patiently, gnawing at the edges of reality until it could no longer be ignored. What we witnessed was not merely a crime scene, but a battlefield where identity and fear waged war, and silence was the weapon that inflicted the deepest wounds. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think reputation can be more dangerous than truth? Can the fear of losing status or identity compel someone to commit acts that ultimately destroy the very foundation they sought to protect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If these stories of crimes driven by identity, fear, and silence fascinate you, make sure to subscribe. We dive deep into the shadows where human nature reveals its darkest corners. And don't miss our next Shadow Crimes episode, where we explore how fabricated personas can escalate into irreversible violence. A chilling reminder of what happens when the masks we wear become prisons. Remember, some secrets don't get exposed. They destroy everything built to protect them.